Gotcha. That doesn't sound bad. All right. We still have some people logging on, but we'll get started in about a minute or so.
I don't know if Roman is here. I sent him an email. For some reason, I have a hard time generating a link to my Dropbox for the slides. Usually
Okay.
it's just a right click and it would give me a link, but it doesn't work right now. So
just give us your password.
Like
and then we'll figure it out.
yeah.
I'll post a link. I'll put it up and post a link to it. Or you could give Mike your password if you like. He's
Awesome.
very
Thanks so much.
He's very trustworthy. I can vouch for Mike. He's trustworthy.
You better get started, Oleg, if you're going to do 2 papers.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so that's right. Sam posed some discipline on me. Good. We want to go ahead and share your screen, Oleg.
Let's see if this works. Yep.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, great. So welcome back, everybody. For those of you who are new, house rules are if you have a question, just unmute yourself and jump in. Don't worry about raising your hand or anything like that. Do we have any co-authors in the audience? I didn't look.
Yes, I think
Cecilia here.
It's too late for her, but
okay.
Max,
Oh, that's right. She's in Europe now. Max is here.
Max is here. I
okay.
saw him briefly.
So you could also leave questions in the chat, and maybe Max will get back to you then. And then, of course, we'll leave the stream open afterwards for more discussion and comments. So, without further ado, Oleg, you've got an hour.
Thank you so much. Well, you got a great seminar, so I'm very happy to make a part of it. I will indeed try to present 2 papers. So one is a paper that we had with Cecile for a while. It's finally in print now, but we've done quite a lot of revisions to it. I want to show a couple of new results from that paper if you've seen the older versions of it a few years ago in the NBR. And then we wrote a follow-up together with Max. We kind of explore, we use the same model, but we explore the government policies in the model that we developed with Cecile. So I'm going to try to focus on the new exciting stuff and kind of go quickly over stuff that's been in the paper for a while. And so let's see how far I can get. So basically the starting point for the paper is that when you look at the data, a handful of firms in each country account for a disproportionate share of total experts. And in fact, there is a paper by Freund and Pirola. So they have this data set in the World Bank. It's mostly developing countries. And in developing countries, these patterns are particularly stark. It could be like that a single firm on average accounts across 40 countries or something like that, accounts for 17% of experts. So it's really a big mass point of experts is done by a single firm. So when you go to somewhat larger and more developed countries, the pattern is less extreme, but this pattern is still there. And so we'll focus on France, a fairly large developed country. That's where the data will come from. And so when you look at the largest French exporter, it accounts for something like 7% of total exports in the country. But then our level of analysis would be something like, 3 or 4 digit industries where all of manufacturing sector is split into something like 200 industries, roughly speaking, right? And then the largest exporter is really a big mass point at that industrial level. So it typically accounts for over 20%, typically something like 30% of experts at the sectoral level is done by a single largest firm. And so you kind of see that experts are very granular, especially if you go at sectoral level experts. And the other piece of motivation is that oftentimes when you look at different policies, and in particular trade policies, the rules are written in such a narrow way that it looks like, certain trade policies target individual firms. They kind of single out the biggest foreign competitors, right? And so this is another kind of intriguing thing is like under which circumstances you really want to go after individual firms rather than the whole industries in implementing different types of policies. Trade policies, well, obviously mergers and acquisitions are about individual firms, but also like industrial policies. Under which circumstances would you want to single out firms rather than industries? And this is the type of question that a granular framework would allow you to ask and answer, right? And so going to granularity specifically in trade, it's kind of interesting that trade and granularity are sort of, always closely related for many years now, because there's been this emphasis on individual firms and experts, at least since the work of Bernard Schott and Redin and Melitz, the theoretical model, right? That it always emphasizes the role of individual firms and experts. But it's kind of interesting that what granularity would really require, on one hand, that requires something like a fat tail distribution, which trade models universally adopt now. So Pareto distribution is kind of the most common distribution used in trade. But then it also requires discreteness, and the intersection of these two give granularity. And it's been explored a lot in the business cycle aggregate fluctuations literature. But in trade, the typical assumption is a continuum of firms. And so what's interesting, once you take a continuum, the fact that you had a fat tail distribution doesn't really matter at the aggregate. The only thing that sort of matters is the location of that distribution. And once you take the integral, only kind of the mean characteristics of that distribution matter. And what's interesting, the way I think about it, one manifestation of that is the ACR result, that it really doesn't matter whether you work in neoclassical models where there are no firms at all, or you work with kind of this modern style of models like a Melitz model, where you acknowledge the presence of firms and that there are fat tails and so on. But at the aggregate, a lot of things look very, very similar, because once you integrate over a continuum of firms, you kind of lose that granularity. And so in the end of the day, it's just kind of very similar to a Ricardian model in many respects. So what we want to do in this paper is kind of acknowledge granularity explicitly and take it seriously and see what would be the kind of additional implications of granularity relative to a continuous model with infinitesimal firms, right? So one thing I need to point out, right? So we're building on quite strongly on the paper by Itham, Kortum, and Sotelo that kind of had largely a very similar motivation that I'm giving here. So that paper was a single sector economy. What we will do in this paper is actually write a multi-sector economy where each sector looks like an Itham, Kortum, Sotelo model. And our goal is to try to figure out the contribution of granularity to the comparative advantage, to the cross-sectoral kind of comparative advantage of the country. Okay, so yeah, so, the big question that we started with was, can individual firms shape the trade patterns of countries, right? Can it, if you give a specific example, for example, to what extent Finland is particularly good at producing tires and cell phones, and it would always be good at producing tires and cell phones, or it was just a kind of like a draw of luck that Nokia, which was the biggest firm in the country, specialized, had the technology in tires and cell phones, and that shaped the export patterns of Finland for a long period of time, right? And so we want to address this question systematically in a larger country than Finland across many industrial sectors, right? Where the role of one single firm is not as pronounced, but nonetheless, you have this very large firms, and to what extent, they drive the export patterns of countries, right? And as we do this, we're going to build on a workhorse model. So it would be a combination of Dornbusch, Fisher, Samuelson across sectors and Melitz kind of within sectors, but we will, have discrete number of firms, right? And so we will take seriously in the data the fact that on average, a French manufacturing sector has 350 firms. So at first that might seem like, well, it's a lot of firms, maybe low for large numbers is a good approximation when you have, 350 firms per sector in the economy, and you have like 100 sectors, right? So it's really a lot of firms. But then if you take the data seriously, you see that the largest firm in a sector accounts for 20% of sales, right? Because the sales distribution is extremely skewed. So you have the Zipf's law in sales. And so we want a model that can account simultaneously for the fact that there are many firms, but the largest firms are really, really large, right? And so the question then is the law of large numbers still a good approximation once you kind of take both of these features of the data seriously, right?
Oleg?
Yep.
Once we start going to granularity, don't you have to take a stand on what level of we want to determine comparative advantage? So like right now, you're the only one who's really talking. So does that mean you have the comparative advantage in research? But over the course of the year, we'll all give maybe not as many talks as you, but it'll sort of even out. So I don't know. It just seems like once we go at this really fine level, it's not really the level we want to be looking at it because there's a lot of lumpiness.
Yeah, so that's a great question. In fact, I mean, we will focus on, we will split all of the French manufacturing into something like between 100 and 300 industries. That will be the level of our analysis. It turns, in principle, our methodology could be applied at any level, and you can kind of check how the answers change as you vary the level of your analysis. And in particular, some counterfactuals you would like to be stable, right? So some decompositions can change, but you would like to run the analysis in different levels, and if the model is well specified, answers to questions like, for example, I'm taking it off the top of my head, like welfare gains from trade. You would rather like that answer not to really be sensitive at which level you do the estimation. And in principle, theoretically, you can see that this could be the case, right? You can slice theoretically sectors at different level, and it shouldn't change some of the counterfactuals. So the question is, if you did it in the data at different levels, would you get different answers or not? It turns out with our data requirement, we cannot go finer in the data, and we cannot really go, our methodology requires to have multiple sectors. So kind of having 100 sectors is sort of like, you don't want to have many fewer than that. So in a way, we couldn't really do it in the data, but in principle, with a lot of data, it could be done at different levels. We kind of were stuck at the level of aggregation that we chose. We couldn't go much finer, and we couldn't really go cruder for our estimation technique. But that's sort of the spirit. And, but empirically, I cannot give you a much better answer because we couldn't do the estimation at a different level of aggregation, really.
Okay.
So, yeah, but it's a great question in a way. If you believe granularity is still important at the very aggregate level, well, it better be that it's still important at sectoral levels as well. And so what I will argue, I think, is that we show that granularity is still very important at 4-digit, shaping the sectoral patterns at that level. And empirically, it's somewhat of a more open question using this methodology, how much does it affect aggregate growth and stuff, right? I'm going to show you growth and sectoral experts, and that it plays a big role on that level. Does it affect growth and aggregate experts is sort of like an open question that I'm not answering with this paper. Okay, and so, we're going to have a model that can speak to these moments in the data, and we're going to use the model for a number of counterfactuals. Some of them would be to try to understand the contribution of granularity to trait patterns in the cross-section. Some of it will be to look in the dynamics, how much of a mean reversion in expert patterns can be attributed to, firm dynamics and granular firm dynamics. So this would be some of the interesting counterfactuals I'll try to show you. And then given the model, we can ask, what's the optimal way to do a tariff in this type of an economy, right? Do you want to put a tariff, for example, on the industry as a whole, or you want to single out individual firms and put a tariff, if you can, on just a subset of firms in an industry, right? So these are the types of things we can do with this model. Okay, so our editor pushed us really hard to try to formalize the concept of granularity and like, what does it even mean to be able to identify it in the data? And so this is something that we really taken as given at first, but we've made some progress in the last iterations on thinking like, what exactly is granularity and under which circumstances you can identify it. And so I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this, because I think oftentimes in the literature, we take a lot of things for granted, but it's useful to spell out exactly what can and what cannot be done, in the data. So, because it's a trade paper, I will focus on export ratio as my object, which is a measure of a country's comparative advantage in a given sector. So basically, I will look at exports divided by domestic expenditure as an export share. And I will look in the cross-section of sectors, right? So that's why it maps one-to-one with other measures of comparative advantage in the cross-section. And you can do a decomposition that total sectoral expert intensity can be decomposed into expert intensities of individual firms weighted by their market shares, where, you know, firm expert intensity is its expert sales relative to the domestic sales, and the market share is just the market share in the domestic market, right? And so note how similar it is to the aggregate macro literature, which tries to decompose the growth rate. You know, so when you do in macro, you like look at the aggregate growth rate and you decompose into the growth rate of individual firms, weighting it by market shares. And so here it's very similar, but we're doing it in the cross section. We have an extra dimension. When you do kind of trade with multiple sectors, you have the extra dimension in which you can look. You can look over time, which we will do, but you can also look in the cross section. And so at first our focus will be on the cross section, but otherwise kind of these two formulas look quite symmetric. And so the way we're going to think about the world is that there is you know, some data generating process, and the model will formalize exactly what this data generating process is, so that both market share and expert intensity are random variables that are drawn from this data generating process, right? And so there is the sectoral dimension. And so we're going to characterize this distribution from which market shares and expert shares are drawn. And it will have a sectoral dimension to it. And if you wish, like the time or general equilibrium dimension to it, right? And the point is that, you know, we can think of the world as being drawn from this data generating process. And there are some characteristics that are stable for a given sector. So if you had to redraw the world, some sectoral characteristic will stay stable, but the draws themselves can change, right? And so the idea of the granularity is that somehow you hold the data generating process constant, but you get a new draws of market shares and expert shares from that process. And you can say that the average, the expected draw, right, is the fundamental stuff. And the departure from that average or expected draw is the granular piece. So in particular, if we're thinking about the realized expert ratio or expert intensity of a sector, it could be split into the fundamental part and the granular part, where the fundamental part is just this expectation of, you know, this is a vector notation for market shares and expert shares, and you kind of take all possible draws weighted by the probability of those draws from this, you know, from the sectoral distribution, right? And so this makes it very clear theoretically what we're trying to get at is that you could redraw the world many, many times, and a sector will have some average level of experts. When across all these draws, you can take an average. And each time you take a draw, the realization will differ from that average. And that gap, we're going to call the granularity of the world, right? So 2 points to make here is that, well, these objects are well defined because we work with like things that are market shares and expert shares, which are bounded, you know, between 0 and some number. Market shares are bounded between 0 and 1. So this is well defined no matter how fat-tailed the distributions are. Even if the continuous limit does not exist, if you're like, if you're below the Zipf's law, continuous limit doesn't exist. But these objects are well defined for any fat tails and for any number of, so this is the number of firms in the sector. So any number of firms in the sector. It's important to understand that the number of firms is itself a random variable which that data generating process will generate, right? And so the second point is that this object, this expected expert share, so like this is something you observe. This is the realized expert share. And this is a kind of like a theoretical object. It's what you expected about it. And in order to define the granular piece, you need to have this, and the granular piece is like a residual, right? And so what's important is that the fundamental piece may or may not correspond to the limit as the economy has more and more firms, right? So the way we're going to write down the model, we will actually be able to take that limit. And indeed, in the model, under certain conditions, you will have the equality. But in general, it doesn't have to be true. And so the point is that the way you learn about the world is not from the asymptotics as the number of firms gets bigger. You have to learn about the world given the observed number of firms, right? So if the industry has 350 firms on average, right? You have to learn about the world, which has 350 firms on average, not try to take the limit as the number of firms will be increasing, because it's not clear that, those theoretical objects would correspond to those limits at all, right? And so as a result, it tells you how the identification can happen, right? So what you need to do, the ideal exercise would be to observe a given industry many, many times, different draws of that industry, right? And so then you can figure out what's the average realization and what's the granular piece to this, right? And so the problem is we don't observe industries many times, right? We can observe industries across countries, or we can observe industries over time, but things change across countries and things change over time. So parameters are kind of not stable, right? So you cannot really, doing that inference is sort of difficult. So the way we're going to do the inference, and it has to be like the important point here, that the inference on granularity kind of has to be structural. You have to make some assumptions, right? Because, because you really observe a sector once, and if you observe sector across countries, well, you again observe sector country once, or if you observe it over time, you observe sector time just once. And so making that inference, you need to make a structural assumption. So the way we're going to do the structural assumption is that the data generating process is parametric. We know the set of parameters, and by observing many different industries in France that are drawn from symmetric data generating processes, perhaps on the different parameters, we can try to estimate, this parameter vector, and we can see how well the estimated model does by fitting the data, and we can play around with different parametric assumptions and see which ones fit the data, which ones don't fit the data. And then if under parametric assumptions you do fit the data, do you agree on answers that the model gives you? Do you agree on this, for example, on this decomposition? And so this is exactly what we do in the paper. So we will postulate a particular parametric, distribution here. In robustness, we're going to play around with different parametric distributions, and we're going to see if the model matches the moments that we picked as like being the important moments out there in the data, how consistently it predicts the answers that we are interested in about, sort of the contribution of granular comparative advantage to overall comparative advantage and to the dynamics of comparative advantage over time. So this is kind of like a lengthy introduction.
Oleg, can I ask it's Jonathan, sorry.
Sure.
Even before you take the parametric approach, it seems there are substantive restrictions in writing this FZ function in terms of, so what kind of interactions are allowed across sectors? It seems like this implicitly restricts something about separability, where like if factor prices change in another industry, it must have symmetric effects across all firms or something, because this seems to reduce the dimensionality of the problem a lot, where the random variable is just random within a given Z, right?
No, so not quite, but you're right in the following respect. So yes, so the links between sectors in this model will be very simple, and they're linked through general equilibrium variables. So wages and incomes will be these general equilibrium variables that kind of move all sectors at the same time. And so they move the data generating process in all sectors simultaneously, right? But you're right that there are no other interactions that we built into this model, right? And so this is obviously something, this helps us in terms of, it simplifies the data generating process. If you had an alternative data generating process in mind with other cross-sectoral linkages, and they could be of different sorts, they could be economic but not general equilibrium, where there are like particular asymmetric patterns of sourcing of one industry from another, or they could be kind of like statistical in the sense that a high productivity draw in one industry might lead to a high productivity draw in the other industry because they link through some technological spillovers, right? We don't allow either of the two. A more interesting model will put both of them in, right? But in terms of, the conceptual thing here, this is all allowed within this data generating process. Because, in fact, I want to condition on some aggregate vector here, and that aggregate vector, effectively the model will have an aggregate vector in there as well, which can shift the, the data generating process, but you can make it not just an aggregate vector, you can make it, more finely defined aggregate vector by subset of industries or something like that.
So suppose, I think I've got it, but just make sure. Suppose I want to say like that the big firms tend to be more capital intensive. Can I just condition on the GE factor price for capital?
Oh, for sure. So this types of thing would be very easy to allow for.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oleg, can I pursue? I'm not sure what your exact claim is with this slide. So let me just give you an example which suggests identification problems and tell me if you're addressing it or not. I have two industries. One is mature and has companies like Apple in it, and another industry is very immature and has a lot of small firms. So I'll have a lot of room scope for granularity in the mature industry and less so in the immature industry. Comparing across industries isn't going to help me understand anything about identification. So I'm just trying to understand what you're claiming here about identification.
Let me show you the specific data generating process and illustrate exactly, your question within that, what we allow and we don't. It comes in a couple of slides. Yeah, awesome, thank you. And do I go until the end of the hour?
Yes, you do.
Okay, so, before I show you the model, I wanted to show you a couple of empirical patterns that we discovered sort of like, more recently than the previous versions of the draft. And I think those empirical patterns are kind of a lot of fun, actually. So the first one, we're just going to do something very simple. So we're going to look in the cross-section of French sectors, well, a panel of French sectors, Z. So we're going to have 300 sectors at 4-digit level. And we're going to look at log experts, and we're going to project it on log domestic size of the sector. So it's the domestic sales total of domestic firms in that sector, and on the size of the top 3 French firms relative to other French firms. So what's important here is that the size variable does not depend on competitive advantage directly, because you compare the large French firms relative to all other French firms. And that market share, at least in the model, it's a relative sales share. It doesn't have to depend on how much the foreign firms sell in this industry, right? So this is a metric of, the distribution of domestic firms, how spaced they are in terms of sales, right? And so what we can do, we can see whether there is a systematic correlation between this measure of skewness in sales. It's like a concentration ratio among only French firms, right? And the experts at the sectoral level of the sector. And the answer is, quite amazingly, there is a very strong association. I mean, it's almost like 1-for-1, that if you increase the market share of the concentration ratio of the top 3 firms by 10 percentage points. So instead of accounting for like 30% of French firm sales, they account for 40. You expect that sector to actually export 10% more. Right, and it's
can I just ask just a definitional question? So this DZ is the total sales of all French firms, but in this sector, but it's not including imports.
Right, because this data does not have imports, and so partly it was convenient not to, link to other data sets for imports. That's why we did it. We could, in principle, we could, control for that other variable. In theory, we can control for either and run regression in both ways. And in theory, it actually turns out not to matter very much which one you control for. But you're right. This is
like in your last slide, I think DZ did include imports.
No.
In your
here?
Yeah, right.
No,
because
so I call the YZ. So YZ would be DZ plus imports.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no, so I mean, we've been careful defining it, but we have to go between these variables, because in the model we check the behavior of both types. In the data, it just like working with this French census data, we don't have imports in it, and we didn't want to do the link for this exercise. Okay, so what's interesting is this very strong association. And I mean, there are many reasons why that could be the case, right? It could be, well, maybe in a standard Melitz model, if a sector has more skewed distribution of sales, that encourages experts, because experts are done by the very large firms. So more skewness is kind of good in the Melitz model. So this is all consistent with that interpretation, of course, right? And so we can check that this is still the case in the panel, not just in the cross-section. But what's most interesting is this dynamic regressions, where we say, what if there is a change in this object from year to year, right? If this large 3 firms gain market share from year to year, do you expect to gain experts or not? And here it's a little harder to make that claim that, some sectors are different, because this is really a year to year change. It's not about the cross section so much. And you kind of see still a strong association. When in a sector, top firms gain sales share, market share, those sectors tend to export more in a year-to-year basis. And so this would be, so we will match in our structural model this coefficient and this coefficient. This would be our targets. But then this would not be a target in the dynamics, and we can check that we get the dynamics right as well in the model,
So,
right? So,
Oleg, I didn't follow that statement. So if I thought about those firms were getting positive shocks and they're getting market share, they should get more export market share. Is it?
That's quite possible. So we don't rule out it as an explanation. So at this stage, there are multiple, I think, explanations to this empirical patterns. I think they're still interesting as empirical patterns, but you can come up with different stories. But now I want to show you another one where we had harder time coming up with additional stories, right? I think this is really more of a direct test of the granularity mechanism. And this is something we can do in a dynamic model. We're going to say, let's try to predict change in experts over the next 10 years. So we start at 97. Can we predict what the experts would be in 2007, right? And we're going to control for the initial level of experts. We're going to control for that same variable, and again, the size of the sector. And so first of all, what you see that there is mean reversion in the data. If your sector exported 10% more than the sector of that size is supposed to export, you expect to lose about 1% of those experts over 10 years. So weak mean reversion, very persistent. Over 10 years, autoregressive coefficient is something like 0.9. But the amazing thing is, if we drop this variable, but include instead, from the previous regressions, the predictor of your expert status, which remember had the coefficient close to 1 in predicting, extra experts, then the coefficient of mean reversion, well, it's not a mean reversion anymore. It's a coefficient of, of experts going down is really much larger. So basically sectors where you have this disproportionately large firms in 97, you expect them to lose about half of their extra experts over the next 10 years, right? So like in 97, you would have predicted that they have 10% more experts, and 10 years later, they will have only 5% more experts. So they're losing about this half of their competitive advantage predicted by the large firms. And so if we include both together, you can kind of see that, about 1/5 of this comes from generic mean reversion, but, 80% of this coefficient comes from, it seems like it comes from this large firms driving it, right? And here it's hard to say that, something changed about the distribution of firms over time necessarily in some mechanical way, right? It's just something about that distribution in 97 predicted what would happen over the next 10 years. And this is exactly what the granular model will predict. So basic firm dynamics, where market shares of individual firms mean revert due to firm dynamics, right? This predicts the outcome for aggregate experts in the granular model. And for us, it was kind of difficult to try to see what are the obvious alternative explanations to this moments, right? And this is something that we'll do in dynamics. The other very interesting thing is a two-stage regression. So in the first stage, predict experts with the granularity variable in 97. And then the second stage, use those predicted, this predicted guy and see whether it causes mean reversion. And this star difference I thought was really cool. Like if you just do, experts in 97, it predicts weak mean reversion. If you project experts in 97 on the granularity variable, it has a much stronger prediction for mean reversion, kind of 4 times bigger prediction for that. And so this is exactly something we can check, in the dynamic model, whether it's consistent with this pattern.
Oleg, can I challenge that? I think it's super interesting. I'm just a little concerned about granularity. We want to think of it as a lot of randomness, rather than industry dynamics. So, for example, in the first of the 2 empirical slides, large firms get even bigger, and that would be correlated with this unobservable called increasing comparative advantage. And in this slide, those firms that were large in US, say in French manufacturing, are the firms that are, for reasons that have nothing to do with granularity, are the ones that are increasingly facing Chinese competition. In other words, I'm not saying that your interpretation is wrong. I'm just saying we need it to have nothing to do with industry dynamics.
You can define granularity in different ways. I will define it in a very, I mean, once I write down the equation, it's very special. So the way I will think about it, in the cross section, you have a fat tail and discreteness of draws. And this will stay stable period by period. So the productivities would be driven by a random growth process with particular properties. So it's a standard industry dynamic models where each cross-section looks granular, but it's consistent with the dynamics, and it has aggregate shocks. And when you think about China, it's one of the aggregate shocks, which I will introduce in a statistical way as well. But I will have a combination of idiosyncratic shocks and aggregate shocks. Both will follow very specific standard processes. And I'm going to see whether that model, matches the data and then can predict the stuff I'm interested in. Yeah. So I'm doing terrible on time, but I'm really happy I showed you this stuff because it's sort of new. The model is very standard. So I will go fast over the model. So the model is really, I'm going to set up Dornbusch, Fisher, Samuelson, Melitz, and Itam, Kortom, Sotelo together. So if you know all those 3 papers, there is really nothing new. So, it's home and the rest of the world. Labor is the only input. France is a smaller country than the rest of the world. They differ in terms of size. There is a Cope-Douglas aggregator like in Dornbusch, Fisher, Samuelson, and we're going to read the Cope-Douglas share from French data. So this would be the expenditure shares on sectors. And this is one of the few things that will exogenously vary across sectors for us. So sectors will differ in terms of their expenditure size, and we just read it off the data. Within sectors, it's Melitz and firms are granular, so it's EKS. What it means is that the aggregator, preference aggregator within a sector, it's CES with this parameter, but it has a discrete number of firms. This is kind of like very standard at this point. And this would be one of the parameters for us that we need to estimate. And so what I note here is at this point, we say that all sectors are symmetric. They have the same sigma, right? Obviously, one extension that we, try to do the best we can is to say, well, maybe sectors are asymmetric in terms of sigmas, right? For example, but for now, all sectors are symmetric in terms of sigma. So what is a Itam, Kortom, Sotelo sector? Well, this is really a distributional assumption on the productivity draws. So the idea is that, think of a Melitz-Chanet model where there is a shadow pool of entrants and they just decide whether to be active in each given market or not, right? So the number of those shadow entrants is drawn from a Poisson distribution. And productivity of each shadow entrant is drawn from Pareto with these parameters. And it turns out that this parameter combination is a sufficient statistic for expected sectoral productivity. So you need to know how many draws there are and what is the location of that Pareto distribution, right? And once you know that, it determines fundamental competitive advantage. And in particular, we'll make this assumption that relative productivity between home and the rest of the world, sector by sector, is drawn from a log normal distribution. And we need to estimate the parameters of that distribution. So the alternative assumptions that we'll do will replace this to check the model. We replace this with a non-fat tail distribution like a log normal. So in our numerical model, it's very easy to put any distribution here you want. So we can do a log normal, which is not fat tailed. And so one thing that happens, the model with log normal just does not feed the data. It gives you a different answers for granularity, but it just does not feed the data that we want to feed. In particular, it cannot simultaneously account for the fact that there are 350 firms and the biggest firm has 20% market share. So for log normal model, those would be impossible moments to fit. And non-surprisingly, it's going to miss on granularity. So this would stay our baseline assumption. We can also replace this with a fat tail distribution like a Laplace. Like instead of log normal, we can do log Laplace, which is sort of like a Pareto two-sided. And the answer is that model matches exactly in the same way the moments like with the log normal distribution. And it is consistent in the answers for granularity. So it turns out the fact that we put a log normal here, you can replace it with a log Pareto, and the models will largely agree because there is enough flexibility in these parameters and the choice of the dispersion of the log normal to match the fatness of the tails and the data across sectors, right? And so this is kind of the robustness that you can do. This is what I was saying. You can play around with different parametric distributions and see whether they agree, right? So going back to Dan's question, so Dan asked me, so there could be sectors that different in terms of theta, which is the Pareto shape of the distribution. So some sectors have a fat distribution to begin with, and some sectors have not a fat distribution to begin with. So maybe this is the way you can capture, you know, more developed sectors and less developed sectors or something like that. So this is how I statistically would try to capture it. In our baseline, theta is common across all sectors. In our robustness, we allow theta to vary in an empirically consistent way to match the heterogeneity in Pareto shapes across sectors that we observe, right? And we actually find that it turns out that a common theta, for an interesting reason, gives a conservative answer. And the reason is the following. You know, if you vary sector, if you vary theta across sectors, some sectors will have more granularity and some sectors will have less. And overall granularity is a right skewed outcome, right? So basically, you don't care about the average, you care about the outliers. By not having theta vary, you don't have as many outliers, it turns out. And so that's why it's a more conservative answer. At first, we thought our intuition was the opposite, but it just turned out, you know, the way we do the exercise, you know, having a common theta results in more conservative amount of granularity in this model. Okay, just to finish with this, the rest of the model, you know, you have standard, you know, you have the marginal cost, you have the fixed cost of entry into the market, the iceberg trade cost, and then in each market, you have an oligopolistic price setting game. So you have markups. So it turns out once you have markups, the model is not analytical anymore. You have to solve it in the computer, and it's kind of a pain because, you know, it just takes time to solve it many times in the computer for estimation. But it's a pretty simple model to solve at the same time in the computer. So we can do it pretty efficiently. And so you can do fairly fancy things with this non-analytical oligopolistic model. It turns out that if you are after positive implications of the model, like the role of granularity in the cross-section or in the dynamics, whether you have variable or constant markups doesn't matter. It just turns out you just scale a little more the productivity distribution. You put a little more dispersion in the productivity distribution with variable markups, and it matches the same moments. So it just, there is not such a big difference whether you do variable or constant markups if you're just about to match cross-section and dynamics. However, once you go for policy exercises, which we do in the second paper, then variable markups are the core of the policy exercises. So the planner is really obsessed with the big markups of the big firms if you try to ask him what policy he wants to do. He really goes after the big firms with big markups, whether you do merger and acquisition, whether you do trade policy, or whether you do industrial policy. The markups is really the key quantitative mechanism in this model, you know, for policy analysis. And so you kind of, it depends whether you do a normative or a positive paper, but, you know, if you can do variable markups, you would probably want to keep them for sure. So if you do policy analysis, I'm going to skip, I don't have all that much time, so I'm going to skip pretty much the rest here. So, you know, you do general equilibrium. So you first need to do entry. You know, this characterizes entry. It's very similar to Itum, Kortum, and Satella. And then you have to solve this big fixed point. You know, you need to solve the price setting game, the entry game, and the general equilibrium vector all simultaneously. So it's like a triple fixed point if you want. And the computer does it pretty fast. So you put some parameters into the model, and it gives you essentially this gives you this data generating process, right? And so literally the model that we set up here is really a, you know, formalization of the data generating process for each sector, where look, sectors differ only in two things. Sectors differ in terms of expenditure shares, which is exogenous, and they differ in terms of realized fundamental competitive advantage, which is driven by this distribution. So once you give me the parameter vector, I get a data generating process. I solve the fixed point of the equilibrium model, and it gives me a data generating process sector by sector. And so now, once I have the data generating process, I can do whatever counterfactuals I want. I can simulate many different economies from the same data generating process and start comparing the average outcomes and the granular outcomes between them.
So Oleg, in other words, you would hold fixed the draws of the capital T, but then redraw the individual firms within the
No, so it depends. So if I want to take a long run counterfactual, I would, well, yeah, so it depends.
I meant more for doing your decomposition between granular and fundamental, that's what you do, right?
Right, for granular and fundamental, you hold the fundamental constant and redraw the firms. Yeah. If you want to make a predictions what will happen in the long run of the economy, you might want to redraw the fundamental as well according to some dynamic process. If you want to do year to year, a dynamic extension of the model will tell you how to do year to year, right? So it depends on which question you want to ask. You either hold constant the aggregate. For your question, what is the extra contribution of granularity? That's exactly what we do. But if you want to do some dynamic counterfactual over 10 years, you want to let the aggregate stuff move as well according to some rule that we will impose.
So I don't understand. So then you'd be just redrawing the firms every year. There's no link between I'm the same firm I was last year, but I got a completely different draw. So I'm basically
okay. Sorry, yeah, I should be clear. Okay, we will do one set of counterfactuals where we're going to do what Sam suggested, where you hold the fundamental constant and you just redraw all firms. And that's kind of like not a counterfactual that you ever observe in the real world. It's just like an abstract counterfactual to split the variation in experts into granular and fundamental component. Then we would want to do dynamic counterfactual in a real dynamic kind of approximation to the world. And then there would be a law of motion, both for individual productivities and for aggregate productivities. And I would want to roll both of them forward in a kind of consistent way over 10 years. Yeah. I will try to show you this in the next 5 minutes. That would be cheeky. Okay, so
Oleg, I have a really question. I'm a little bit puzzled by what you call long run, because the your latent potential entrance would be adjusting if you were thinking about the long run, because I would imagine in the static sense, there's some kind of free entry.
Yes.
Condition, okay. But in the longer run, these things will be perturbed. So,
right.
Whether MZ would be start to
adjust, we make simplifying assumption. I think this is, Daniel, I think this is what you're after. So I know people don't like this assumption, but the assumption that we make that this is a Melich-Chanet version of the model. So you have the shadow pool of entrants from the beginning of time. They never enter or exit. They're like just hanging out there. And each period they decide whether to be active or not. As a result, the entry game becomes a static one-period decision with no intertemporal linkages. This is, of course, a simplification to be able to solve it, right? Otherwise, the entry, like if we did the Melitz version of the dynamics, where it's really entry each period forever, right after that, then it becomes an intertemporal problem and it's very difficult. Yes, that's what you were asking, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So we make quite a number of shortcuts to be able to solve it in the computer with, at low computational costs. I'm going to skip estimation because this is fairly standard. So, I mean, just to give you an illustration, what we will try to do in our estimation is try to match the distribution of number of entrants across industries in France. And so you see some industries have 10 entrants, on average it's 350, but some industries have 10,000 entrants. And so this is the comparison of how the model and the data line up. And we say, well, pretty good, given that the model has only 6 parameters, basically, right? And this is the top market share. So this is the share of the largest French firm relative to other French firms, sector by sector. And on average, this is 20%. And then there is big variation. So there are sectors where it's like 40, 50%. And there are sectors where it's less than 10%. And so this is how the model does on that distribution. And we kind of claim success here that we get the average right, and we actually get the distribution sort of right. And then we're going to look at cross-sectional, then we're going to look at the correlation between the two. And we get the correlation between the two in the cross-section, right as well. And so we kind of claim success of matching the data, and we just proceed. And so what I'm going to do next, I want to show you a couple of results. I'm going to just literally show you kind of a sample of things that you can do with the model. So first of all, the cross-sectional decomposition. So I split all sectors in the simulated model in terms of expert intensity, in terms of this expert share. So these are the expert intensive sectors, and these are not expert intensive sectors. So this is like competitive advantage sectors, you know, high competitive advantage. The blue bars is the contribution of those deciles of sectors to total experts of the country. So you see, you take 10% of sectors and they account for 33% of experts when you slice them according on this dimension, right? So like, you know, comparative advantage sectors do account for a lot of experts, right? And so the blue bars kind of show you this kind of skewed pattern. The red bars is what part of those experts are granular. So that if you reshuffle the world, the red bars will go away. The red bars is what will go away when you reshuffle the firm realizations. And so what's kind of amazing here that you see that 70% of sectors, by construction, granularity does not create more trade. Granularity reshuffles trade by construction from one sector to another, because some sectors will have bad news in terms of firm productivity draws, and some sectors will have good news. By construction, we made it mean zero. And so you see that in 70% of sectors, granularity is a mild negative news. You just, you know, this little red bars here, it's mild negative news. But in 30% of sectors, it's positive news, and in particular in the most expert intensive sectors. So about a quarter, 25% of experts in the most expert intensive sectors are of the granular nature. So if you reshuffle the world, those sectors would lose those 25% of experts.
So
and
Oleg,
those
I'm trying to think about this right-hand bar here. So this is the Airbus bar. Okay.
Which bar?
The right-hand bar here. This is the Airbus bar.
Airbus.
Yeah.
What is the right-hand bar again? The red? The red.
Well, no, this bar is like super export intensive. This is Airbus. Okay.
Right. Okay, fine. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it's, I don't know, what do I know about Airbus? I mean, it's like manufacturing aircraft is like a super high fixed cost thing. And it's a super concentrated industry worldwide and also super government subsidized. And it has all of these characteristics. And, you know, I'm trying to tell a story here where this is, you know, there are just some industries where fixed costs are really high.
Absolutely.
And so in the world as a whole, we have few firms. And those firms export a lot to other countries. And, you know, randomly, some of them are located in some countries and some in other countries. And that's what is driving this story. Could that
Yes,
be what's going on?
I think Airbus is such a peculiar industry that is just a bad example for thinking about a typical industry, because we have, you know, a couple of hundred industries here. And, you know, in a typical industry, you will not have such a dominant single firm. And so this is what I kind of showed you in the distributions. I should come up with really good examples. It's like, you know, typical industry has 350 firms, with the largest firm having a 20% of the market, while the airline industry is kind of totally crazy. It's totally off the charts, right? And we don't weight really industries with really big firms in particular, right? So our typical industry is not Airbus at all, right? It's true that perhaps industries that are here are closer to the Airbus industry than the average industry. That's true.
Like that's why these guys are accounting for a big chunk of exports, French exports, is because these super concentrated industries are also super big and super export intensive. So in terms of the aggregate, those are important. But then I start to think about some sort of, you know, fixed cost story for this, which seems a bit different from your story.
No, I totally agree with you. I think if you start thinking about Airbus, you have to appeal to the fixed cost that really makes it a highly oligopolistic industry with just two competitors worldwide. But there is a huge number of suppliers in this industry, of very large suppliers of pieces of, you know, engines and so on. And then I think it's really better to think of other types of industries where you have hundreds of firms competing. So I really want to think about the typical industry where still hundreds of firms are competing. And what I know in particular, these industries tend to be industries with many, many firms on average as well. These are not industries with a handful of firms globally. So I think just Airbus, I should come with better examples with the names of the industries and types of firms. But we also were thinking about Airbus, and we just realized that for accounting for the full cross section of French sectors, that industry would just be a very different. And indeed, you probably want to think about fixed costs. But one thing I want to point out, from the point of view of matching the number of firms across industries, we did not have to appeal to heterogeneous fixed costs to explain that you'll have some indices with very few firms and some indices with huge number of firms. It's true, if we allowed for heterogeneous fixed costs, we could match probably more moments, but we would need more moments as targets as well, right? In order to estimate a model with kind of more dimensions that could vary across sectors. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of punting on your question. I should have a better answer, but I'm thinking of a more typical industries with a large number of firms nonetheless. George, because this was such a good question, can I take an extra 5 minutes in the end? I think it's a yes. So this was one result that I was going to show you. I'm going to skip a couple of other things. I want to show you one result from dynamics, which I think is pretty cool. So going back to a lot of questions, how would you do dynamics here? Well, the answer is you have to postulate the evolution of this productivity draws. And I think this is a little bit of a value added of this paper, is thinking how you postulate industry dynamics with aggregate shocks. So you keep cross-section as a standard trade model in each period. And so it turns out that this is what you have to do. So this is borrowed from Gov't. If you want to keep cross-section a Pareto, you have to use this random growth process. But the innovation here is that we say it's a productivity relative to some cutoff, moves according to a random growth process, and it reflects, so you see this absolute value here, it reflects from the lower bound. It has some mean growth rate, which will be negative because you want to keep things stable, because otherwise it's a random walk that blows up. So you need a random walk with downward drift, reflection from the bottom, and this is the volatility of the innovation. So the bigger is this volatility, the more granularity, idiosyncratic granularity you will have, right? In addition, the location parameter of the whole productivity distribution shifts around as well. So this is the aggregate shock, which shifts the whole location of the productivity distribution in the industry. And this is an AR1 process around some sectoral mean, right? And so what will happen in the long run, you have to redraw the sectoral, stuff around this long run means, but there would be a variation in this aggregate stuff, which is driven by an AR1 process, year to year. And the innovation of that is the volatility of the aggregate shocks, right? And so our goal now is to, well, first of all, there is a lemma saying that under some parameter restriction, in particular, the drift should be this, and the autoregressive parameter should be this. If that's the case, and you start from suitable initial conditions, each cross-section will look like a standard trade model with the Pareto individual firm productivities and a log normal fundamental comparative advantage, just like we assumed in the static model. And then the whole point is try to estimate these two objects for idiosyncratic shocks and for aggregate shocks. And the way we're going to estimate it, we will match the mean reversion in aggregate experts and the mean reversion in individual market shares, right? And if you estimate those two, this is exactly two parameters that are enough to get at these two guys here and here, because they drive the mean reversion in those two processes, right? And so, these are the mean reversion parameters. We match them exactly because we have two parameters. And then we can start doing different counterfactuals. And so in particular, we can say year to year, how much granularity does account for changes in export patterns of countries. And so if we do year to year, about 25% of changes in export patterns are driven by idiosyncratic productivity dynamics of firms.
But Oleg, is it? So this comes down to my first question. There's something mechanical about this. I could be losing the SI could be evolved. There's this thing called China, which is driving both fundamental and granularity. And there's something mechanical about how you're assigning it here.
Yes.
Because there's this, right? You take my point.
It's a mechanical statistical process. If you wanted to be very kind of fine empirically about it, you could try to put variables into this process, like a variable for China, which shifts with different loadings of different sectors on that. So you would like introduce it here as an additional variable and try to estimate it sector by sector. And in principle, conceptually, you could do the same thing, right? What we do here is we take a very statistical approach and just have like mean reverting process for one, mean reverting process for the other, which at a very crude level matches the data, right? Without going into fine variables like China and so on. And so one can use this methodology structurally, but like add the more empirical part of this extra variables into the regressions and try to simulate this, you know, more economic shocks, not the statistical shocks, right? But more economic shocks. Yeah, so we kind of developed the methodology here, but of course, there could be, you know, many much more interesting applications just than the statistical one, right?
Oleg, could I have a question? I'm at the risk of being called an IO person again. It seems like your data is way more than what you are having here. You know, for instance, you know, John Sutton used to document there's a lot of like persistence of leaderships of these firms within their industry. When you talk about granularity, you know, like you have micro level data. I don't understand why you do not use more micro moments to discipline these kind of thermodynamics process rather than, you know, resort to these kind of like aggregate.
So in the cross section, we use the micro level moments, which I did talk about, right? In the dynamics, we only have two parameters because cross section stays the same. So we only have two extra parameters. So you have to choose, you know, you either will have over identification or you choose two moments. So in the paper, we did over identification with more micro moments, with like looking at mean reversion of only the largest firms, of like 20% of the largest firms versus all firms. And it actually turns out that the way we calculated this mean reversion of micro level market shares, it's actually really driven by the mean reversion of large firms. Because we look at the reason is that we look at a balanced sample over 10 years, and only very large firms live for 10 years, it turns out. So it kind of skews you towards, you know, focusing on the large firms.
All right, so Oleg, you're into your injury time now. So if you want to wrap up, then we'll open back up for questions and all these guys can come back and tell you how they feel.
Yes, perfect. I want to show you one thing about dynamics, one picture about dynamics, and one picture about policy, and I will go, yes. And I blame it on very good questions. So one picture about dynamics. Here, we kind of bin sectors by their granularity, and we ask, do we expect them to mean revert? And you see that very granular sectors, this is a very strong mean reversion from very granular sectors in terms of their expert share, right? So most sectors will actually gain in terms of their expert shares because they had bad news in terms of granularity. But the top sectors will actually lose expert shares over 20 and 50 years here. And this is driven by mean reversion in, you know, at the idiosyncratic micro level, industry dynamics. And if we switch off the aggregate shock, the picture looks very similar. So without any aggregate shocks, you expect very similar pattern of mean reversion purely driven by idiosyncratic shocks. And if I ran the same regressions as I did in the data, I will get qualitatively very similar patterns. In the model, they're somewhat weaker actually than the ones that we found in the data. So I could do the same regressions and kind of this firm level granular variables predict mean reversion and experts in the model. This was one thing. The other thing, and this is just a teaser on policies, and I feel really bad that, I mean, I guess I was invited to discuss policies, but I'm just gonna give you a teaser. It turns out, first of all, you can make a lot of progress analytically in trying to characterize the effects of policies in partial equilibrium. General equilibrium is a hard part, and this is where we simulate, but understanding a lot of the policies, in the paper now, we actually have formulas. And so what I'm curious is, can you combine those formulas with the analysis and optimal policy literature at the aggregate level to kind of figure out the analytical granular implications? And so, but I'll show you one illustration which I like in particular, and this would be the granular tariff. And so here, I do a tariff on a whole industry, every single foreign firm, versus a tariff on a single biggest foreign firm. And I split the industries by competitive advantage of the foreign. So this is the foreign competitive advantage. So I can do it in industries where foreign has a lot of competitive advantage, and this would be around here in this part, right? And so by construction, I set the tariff. So the tariff revenue in yellow. So the yellow line is the same. So I collect the same tariff. In one case, by putting the tariff on every single firm in the foreign on every single foreign importer. In the other case, on the single largest foreign importer. And the amazing thing that you see is, the big difference comes in terms of consumer surplus. So the green line here is a big loss in consumer surplus. Why? Well, because when you put a tariff on the whole industry, there would be a lot of pass-through of the tariff into consumer prices, even with variable markups. Well, because you put a tariff on every foreign firm, they have strategic complementarities between themselves, and they're all subject to the tariff, so they all raise the prices. If you put a tariff on only on one big foreign firm, then you have much less loss in a foreign consumers, in a home consumer surplus, and a much bigger loss in the foreign producer surplus. Why? Because of the variable markups and putting a tariff on a single firm, you really force that firm to move markups a lot. And so the pass-through to consumer prices are much smaller from that tariff, but a much bigger loss of the foreign producer surplus. And so as a result, these granular policies are really favored by the government, because the government can really try to target the individual markups of firms that it views as being too big, if it's foreign firms, or if it views it as being not big enough, if it's the domestic firms and you're trying to steal the foreign consumer surplus. And so as a result, when you have the industrial policies, when you try to subsidize some of the domestic firms, or when you have tariffs, or when you have mergers, in this model at least, the biggest consideration is to redistribute between domestic consumer surplus and foreign producer surplus, or the other way around. And so this comes out as quantitatively kind of the first order feature when we analyze the policies. So I will view it as a teaser of what we do in the policy analysis. And I will just conclude with that. The world is granular. I mean, we're developing the tools to work with this. And I think there are a bunch of applications. So I kind of tried to do a teaser of, policy application, but I think there are many other implications. One that I'm, particularly excited about is to think to what extent cities are granular, right? And to what extent productivity of individual cities is made up by individual firms. So like switching analysis from industries to cities. And I think a lot of the tools that we have developed here could be really extrapolated to the geography as well, and kind of giving answers in a similar context. And I'm sorry for going over time, but I'm done.
All right, thanks, Oleg. Okay, so we'll just leave the stream open. If you have a question or comment, you can jump in, or if you want to raise your hand, feel free to do that as well.
I'll just kick it off for a second. So when I think of granularity and the other work, kind of like in the macro literature, it's really about there being some sort of aggregate effects of the granularity. Here, it doesn't seem like there's any aggregate effects. And in fact, I somehow feel like I could take a GE model that I've written down and just do a balls and bins version like Rock Armenta did, and could have hit all the data that you hit before. So can you somehow tell me, like, what, is it, can I not do that, or is it?
Two parts. I'm not sure I fully follow second, but the first one, you're absolutely right. We designed the model where there are no aggregate effects of granularity. So aggregate quantities, aggregate, general equilibrium vector does not change when you redraw individual firm productivities here. So wages and incomes stay the same across draws. Why did that happen? Because we had a continuum of sectors. Obviously, the simplest way to relax it is to also have a finite number of sectors, and then granularity can play a role at the aggregate as well. And so it could be, in terms of model simulation, it could be readily done. You have to think perhaps a little harder how to estimate the model where the general equilibrium vector is itself subject to granularity. I mean, I think it could be an interesting identification, further identification challenge, but I think it's doable. And
but I guess then, sorry to interrupt, but I guess then, like, really all you've kind of told us is that there's a bunch of noise in the data, and that noise doesn't generate any new mechanisms. And so I'm not sure that this is noise I should care about at this point. And that's
Okay.
what I was trying to understand. Like, every model with firms has some noise in it. And usually it washes out, and, it washes out in a nice way because we have continuum. And I'm just trying to figure out, like,
Right.
it doesn't seem like there's a new mechanism here yet.
Two levels of answers here. So this sounds, I would call it an ACR question, like,
Sure.
why do we care about, firms if some of the counterfactuals are exactly the same in the neoclassical model? And you're absolutely right that if you're interested in aggregate GDP or aggregate growth, granularity washes out in this model. Now, if you're interested in trade patterns and how do you do inference from observant sectors into sectoral productivity levels, then it's not noise, right? So for example, can you read the expert share and figure out the productivity, like, the whole Item Cortum, I guess, Nyman Romales literature, yeah, they would look at expert patterns and recover from that the fundamental productivity of the sector. You couldn't do that in the granular world. In the granular world, there would be a gap between the realized trade share and the fundamental productivity of the sector. And so depending on the counterfactuals that you want to do, it could matter for some of them and not matter for the others. And finally, once you go to policy analysis, the policy implications, I mean, what I showed you is the policy implications would be very different in a model which is monopolistic competition with a constant markup level across all firms and an endogenous markup like in the granular model, right? And so if you do policy, the answers would differ as well. So I guess at the end of the day, it's not like for each question you can have a uniform answer. Some questions like ACR type of questions, you're right. You shouldn't care about granularity perhaps. And we checked aggregate gains from trade are pretty well approximated by the ACR formula in this model indeed, right? But there are some other questions. For example, can we try to understand why there is mean reversion in trade patterns of countries like, Hansen, Linden, Mundler paper? For those questions, granularity would matter a big deal. And so, it depends which questions, I guess, interest you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's where Daniel's question comes up. You have the firm data, and sort of that speaks to, the firm data speaks to sort of a different model. And, I guess, there's this tension, like, do we write firm models? Do we write industry models that are a small set of firms? Or do we write, models of industries that are a large number of firms? And I guess I'm not quite convinced that I want to be writing like these industries with granular as opposed to writing, continua that I pull finite number of firms. But I've asked a lot of questions.
Yeah, no, so I have a quick reaction to that is that, I mean, it's true if you're, for some questions you want to go finer and actually focus on an individual industry and just do analysis at one industry level. For a lot of IO type of questions, perhaps this is the right level. What we try to do here is kind of ask the way trade typically asks questions that apply to, a cross section of industries where you cannot quite do the fine IO analysis industry by industry because there are just too many. So we try to, pick up the systematic patterns across a number of manufacturing industries. And I mean, I hope for some applications that's the right level of analysis. So I think the application that in a way we like the best from the positive perspective is the dynamics of competitive advantage. And I think that's the right level of analysis for that, because for competitive advantage, you need to have many industries simultaneously. It's not defined with one industry, right? So for policy analysis, it's a bigger question. Do you want to do this, kind of broad thing across many industries, studying the tariff, or you should do one industry at the time and do a much more IO approach to that? So I agree, but
Oleg, I have a clarifying question for your policy analysis. I've been wondering whether here in the final results you were showing us, is it really the granularity matters or it's the variable markups? I was having thinking about like a thought experiment that, you generate on demand side. You could have like, ACDR or any kind of like variable markups generate from kind of demand structure, but maintain the monopolistic competitive structure, and you do your policy analysis. I've been wondering what's the fundamental thing matters there for your results.
So that's true. You could write, for example, a Kimball model with variable markups, but in the Kimball model, the policy would be a little kind of not the way you will have to do it is you
can say I target the top 20%.
Exactly.
Rather than say the largest, but still, as long as they account for the same market share, I think it's not granular matters. It's really the market share per se matters. So
yes,
so
you
here
need
I
to
think
target
that's
a mass of firms to the extent.
Yeah, exactly.
You could do similar policy analysis in a model with continuum of firms, where you, with a granular tariff, would be a tariff that targets, exactly as you say, firms that account for 30% of experts. And I mean, it's a quantitative question whether, Atkinson-Bernstein is exactly equivalent to some version of Kimball calibrated to the same moments or not. There is no theoretical result that they would say that they're exactly equivalent, but, quantitatively, it could be well the case that Kimball model will give you very similar answer to Atkinson-Bernstein if you target the same mass of firms, essentially, in a Kimball model. That's right. I mean, I think it's a correct question. A correct answer to this question. I mean, there is a second part to it. The world really looks like we target individual firms rather than, in theory, you can do the mass of firms. In the data, industrial policies oftentimes apply to single firms, to a handful of individual firms. Like, for example, the tariffs and or sanctions or anti-dumping duties can be imposed on a single firm, right? And this is the model with a granular number of firms tells you that's exactly what you actually would want to do if you acknowledge granularity.
Yeah, I agree.
Oleg, can I ask a question about?
Sharon, I heard just one word, but I lost you.
Can I ask a question about the dynamic regressions you ran?
Yeah.
If I can. The growth regression. So I was just curious, maybe I'm just misinterpreting the regression, but I was wondering, like, do you have a sense of how do you ever control for growth in D when you do, have you controlled for growth in D when you do these kinds of regressions? The next one, the growth regression.
Yes. So the reason
sorry, go.
We did 4-digit fixed effects, which would absorb that in computation. And we did 2-digit fixed effects in the other, which is not quite the same. So there was a reason, I'm trying to remember why we could not control. We had to drop that variable.
Okay.
And we actually tried to run those regressions both in the data and in the model. And I need to remember what was happening, but both the data and the model were not giving good stuff in similar ways. And we certainly cannot do it when we include 4-digit fixed effects, because that would be absorbed. But when we include only 2-digit fixed effects, we can do it, mechanically. So the question is, there was an argument why we didn't want to do it. And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it. Okay,
because I guess what I'm wondering about is, it looks like the actual mean reversion parameter doesn't change much when you include the shares. And I guess, so then I was wondering if—
Do you mean this guy, and
0.13 and 0.11 don't change much.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then, so then I wonder, like, suppose that what's going on is like entrants are just forecasting that this is a shrinking industry. And so exports shrink, it's a shrinking industry. And so we just don't enter. And so you have jacked up shares with many firms.
One thing that we wanted it to do on balanced sample of firms always, so that we don't have the extensive margin, because extensive margin indeed can be a signal of comparative advantage or of aggregate productivity shocks. So the way we do this regression, all of these variables here, this guy is defined on a balanced sample of firms. So, we look at firms that survived from 97 to 2007.
Okay.
And we look at the relative sales shares of the top 3, in 97 relative to all other firms, but only the subset of firms that are in the balance panel. And the reason was exactly that we didn't want the extensive margin. Extensive margin could be driven by aggregate shocks indeed, which would be in the denominator of this variable. Okay. But I mean, I would be curious if you see what are the other pitfalls of this. I mean, we really tried hard to think through, could there be like a mechanical relationship that we're picking up, that it's really not about economics, but you end up, getting it when you run the regression this way. And we actually couldn't come up with what would be a mechanical explanation here.
Okay, thanks.
Can I pick up where we left with Daniel? Because I was puzzling over this. I don't think you did this with your tariff targeting, but this would definitely break the link between markup slash market shares. You have a sequential entry game in the background. So when I put that tariff on, and this is going to hark back to like the strategic trade rent shifting of the 1980s. When I put the tariff on, I might actually prevent this firm from entering long run.
Right. No, so this is
So
a
that
great,
would break that link between what exactly you're targeting.
it's not part of the model, but it's likely a part of the real world. So I agree that in the real world, it's a very important consideration. In the model, this doesn't happen for the following reason. First of all, we have a pool of the shadow firms that exist always. So it doesn't deter some productivity draw not to ever appear, right, in the model, which in the real world could be the case that you were, because of the fixed cost of some sort or a tariff, you happen not to do some action, and it has this, history effect on the whole path of productivities in the future. So here it's not going to be the case because the shadow productivity process runs in the background in the model. This is one reason. The second reason is that it's a single fixed cost model. So this is what Dorian was asking me, is like maybe some indices have different fixed costs, or maybe some type of firms have different fixed costs. And so the point here is that you have so much skewness in firm size, and 300 firms enter on average per sector, that the guys who are deterred from entry are so tiny that in this model, they're completely irrelevant. So it's true, in other models, it could be that the tariff on the whole industry can operate largely through the extensive margin. In fact, for example, we know that ACDR kind of result, the Arkalakis, Castino, Donaldson, Rodriguez, Clark, all of the action is through the extensive margin there. And so, you don't want to miss out on the extensive margin in those models. In this model, it turns out we actually try to think of policies that will operate on the cost of entry and deter some firms from entering. And it's completely quantitatively trivial in this model because the marginal firms that choose not to enter are completely irrelevant, right? And it's not to say that this is a statement about the real world. It's a statement about this quantitative model. I'm sure, in the real world, this is an important mechanism. You just will have to use a different model to think about it. These are great questions. I mean,
I said this has been a very lively discussion today. Yeah. Anyone else comments or questions?
Yeah, I was gonna keep ragging the puck here. This kind of goes back to George and also kind of what Daniel Zhu was saying is like one of the things that you're kind of turning off. Like, let me put an example. Like I think about Boeing, and this isn't about trade policy, but it's about regulation policy. Is the 737 MAX has an issue, right? And then the rest of the world's thinking we're not going to buy this plane from the U.S. And it's such an important export in the U.S. that both for like aggregate trade and for aggregate GDP, I mean, it literally could have pushed us into a recession, just the 737 MAX issue. But this thing, like that kind of thing is all, that's super interesting. That's when I think about granularity, I think about that, but you're just kind of like washing all this stuff away and trying to kind of want to pull it back to the continuum issue. That's what I find. I feel like that there's a tension here in some of the, like everything that you're doing behind this is that I kind of still want to be tethered to a continuum in some way, shape, or form that throws out, I think, some interesting issues that
I fully agree. And in fact, the very interesting historical example is that, Nokia in Finland was driving the full current account, the dynamics of the current account. When Nokia issues bonds and borrows, it drives the current account of Finland into the deficit, right? And it's very similar with your example of Boeing, but, US is just a much bigger country that, I'm not sure if it would be a full-scale recession or it would be like a recession for some states and so on. But the point is well accepted that in a way, these are some of the most interesting questions. since we focused on different questions, we decided to simplify our life on that dimension. Now, if you wanted to take this framework and think about it, I think it would be important to acknowledge that the number of industries is finite, and you have skewness both in terms of experts within industries as well as experts of whole industries across industries, right? That if Boeing, if airplanes are such a big item of experts for the United States, that industry would be itself granular from the point of view of the economy, and you want to allow that in the model. It would, getting rid of the integral is easy. What's more difficult is, making industry really important in the world level relative to domestic sales. So you need to have like an industry where the experts are so much bigger than the domestic sales, that and perhaps like airplanes is a good example. And so you would just have to have more parameters in the model in order to accommodate that as a possibility. It turns out why it did not, I don't think it affects us very much, because we treat industries in our estimation symmetric. We have like this, in our structural estimation, we have 119 industries, and we treat each of them symmetrically without weighting it by sales shares. And as a result, airplanes would be just perhaps one of those 119 industries. And so in that sense, it's not driving our results, and we're kind of more estimating it off the more typical industries. So that's what I was trying to answer, Dorian. But
yeah,
of course,
but this is what I found so strange is you kept saying, like, I want to think about granularity, but then you say I want to think about the typical industry, and that seems like I want to think about the average, and that's what like I'm kind of like, this is kind of all puzzling me about this, the language that you keep.
Yeah, I mean, by construction, I wanted my industries to be symmetric in granularity. It's just in 70% of industries you see bad news, and you don't see a very large firm. And in 30% of the industries, granularity is good news, which manifests itself as a, outsized large firm. And this is just one approach to thinking about the data. I think what both you and Dorian suggest is maybe you should not think of industries as being symmetric, and really think of granularity at the industry level, not just at the firm level. And this is, very well accepted. For a lot of the questions, you want to have granularity at both levels. And I think it's just a slightly more difficult exercise, which we didn't do in this paper. But, I would say it's a very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, in a way, the answer is I'm showing you what we've done so far. And
no, I think that's completely fair. I think it's just like, there's so many interesting questions about this, about the Boeing thing. Like I'm obsessed about the Boeing thing. And it's more in the policy issue. It's like the Boeing, like, I don't think the issue is it's about like variable markup on Boeing, but it's just like, it's systemic. Boeing is a systemic like industry and any trade policy directed at Boeing. You look at the US-China trade war, they were conscious not to touch Boeing. They didn't put targets on stuff on HS code 88 or whatever. Like they were trying to avoid this because that's super sensitive. Yeah. And the thing is but by not having that there, it's super interesting. I mean, that's kind of what's I think is kind of missing.
So I would say one big thing that we're missing, another big thing that we're missing is the input-output linkages. And so once you start thinking about Boeing, then you really, if that's the industry of your focus,
yeah, for sure,
then you want the input-output linkages with other industries. And this is kind of seems also like a next step in modeling is to introduce input-output linkages and see what is the interaction between granularity and that, which we haven't done here. The second thing I was going to say, once you start thinking about cities or geographies, you have to do that, right? Because like each city is probably dominated by a handful of industries. It's kind of interesting that I'm not sure Boeing is the biggest industry in state of Washington, right? Because Amazon is there. And because, well, it's actually not just, it's 4 big companies, right? It's Microsoft, Amazon, Boeing, and Starbucks. And I think Boeing comes third. But for sure, you have to acknowledge that industries themselves are granular if you want to do the geography. And so kind of if you want to move to finer geographies from this, I think that's kind of an essential step is to acknowledge that industries are granular. And we have not figured out exactly what's the best way to do it. So that's why my answer is definitely not satisfactory, that there must be, an interesting way of like, acknowledging exactly this stuff about the individual industries.
So great, Oleg. Thanks so much. Are there any more comments? So I'm going to turn off the live stream.